Welcome to the Mindset Game podcast. I'm Vered Kogan, and it is a huge delight to introduce you to Dr. Robert Brooks. Bob is a clinical psychologist on the faculty of Harvard Medical School and former director of the Department of Psychology at McLean Hospital, a private psychiatric hospital in the Boston area. Dr. Brooks has lectured nationally and internationally and written extensively about such topics as resilience across the lifespan, parenting and family issues, motivation, and creating positive school and work environments. He is the author or co-author of 21 books, including Raising Resilient Children, The Power of Resilience, Achieving Balance, Confidence, and Personal Strength in Your Life, and Reflections on Mortality, Insights into Meaningful Living. He has won numerous awards for his work, including the most recently, He has won numerous awards for his work, including most recently the Mental Health Humanitarian Award from William James College in Massachusetts for his contributions as a clinician, educator, and author. Dr. Brooks has also served as a consultant to Sesame Street Parents Magazine. I met Bob when he was a guest speaker in one of the courses that I took last semester. The professor is Dr. Beth Freites, and the course was called Well-Being from the Inside Out. And Dr. Brooks was there to speak with us about resilience. And it is such an honor to have you here, Dr. Brooks. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, you are truly an expert in the area of resilience. And I wonder, and for our listeners to kind of get to know you also a little bit better, how did you get into this field?
It wasn't like when I became a psychologist, I said, I'm going to become a resilience expert. It was almost forced on me in some sense. And I'll share with you why. I grew up at a time professionally when it was what we call a deficit model. Just list all the deficits people have. And I always saw both children and adults in my practice and then fix them. I know I'm being a little sarcastic with that. And what started to happen is, just to tell you about a few positions I held, one was working in the inner city of Boston when I was a relatively young psychologist. And as you look back, you can see some of the seeds of where you're going, not at the time, but some of the seeds where you're going. And I became very interested and asked the question, how does someone grow up under racism and poverty? And yet, as adults, they're much more hopeful and optimistic than one would have ever guessed. And then probably the position that led me an interest in both resilience in adults as well as children was at McLean Hospital. McLean Hospital is one of the oldest psychiatric hospitals in the United States, founded in 1811. But interestingly enough, they did not serve children or adolescents till the 1970s. And one of the heads of McLean had heard about my work working in the inner city of Boston. And he said, we're setting up this whole child and adolescent program. And these kids were going to be in the hospital for a number of months, and we're going to need a school here. And I read about some of your work because I did a great deal of work in the Boston schools. So we're going to need a school where the inpatient kids could go, and we are going to need a head of a school. And he said, how would you like to apply to become first head of the school here at McLean? I was so young and naive. I remember saying, a principal. I actually could be head of a program. Wasn't that naive? I foolishly applied for the job. They foolishly offered it. I foolishly accepted it. And I'll just give a quick summary because I could spend 5 hours on this. I had worked with tough, challenging kids before, but I had never worked with these kids. But I should note the first 2 months were wonderful. They were the planning phase. I hired my entire staff of clinicians and educators. And I remember telling my wife, I miss working in the inner city, but this new job is a job made in heaven. I said this too quickly because it was until the kids arrived. And I kiddingly say, have you ever noticed schools are very different without the children there? So, quick summary, I think within about 6, 7 weeks, I totally burned out emotionally, physically, and spiritually. I would get up every morning with a headache or stomach ache, which was not me. And part of it was I thought the kids were getting worse under my care than better. They were getting more angry. no, I wasn't thrilled with my staff. They weren't thrilled with me. When things aren't going as you would like, everyone could blame everyone else. And often in my workshops, I will say to people, whatever the role is, what were two or three of your best days as a professional? What made them so good? What are two or three of your worst days? What made them so difficult? But what did you learn from both? Like I work with a lot of parents, and so tell me two or three of your best days as a parent, two or three of your worst. And the answers people give tell you a lot about their goals and expectations. The same when I work, with leaders. What would have been two or three of your best days as a leader, two or three of your most challenging, and what did you learn from both? So the worst day I think I had, probably the others, was the day I actually sat down to write my resignation letter. And by the way, I ripped it up, and I worked full time in McLean for 23 years, and I still do training for them. I ripped it up because here I was a young psychologist, and I thought some of my older patients were all of like 50. I would hear what they had to say, and so many of them had these regrets about not pursuing a certain goal or too quickly quitting at it. And this was then the turning point. I did take a couple of mental health days. And I came back and I realized something that's going to sound, I don't know, so simple. I said, these kids are not going to change until my mindset and behaviors and that of the staff change. Because I said, our form of discipline is punishment. We really don't show some of the respect we should to these kids, as difficult as they are. We mainly look at what their problems are and not what their strengths are. And so, these turning points, I always talk about what were some of those turning points, and I ask people in your life, and that's where the seeds of resilience really started. And at that point, there was very little written really about resilience. There was Emmy Werner, who was a Holocaust survivor, and she had started a lifelong study, I'll say, in the island of Kauai in Hawaii. Michael Rutter, a British psychiatrist, was writing about it. And so at that point, I started saying, you focus so much on what's wrong with people. What you really have to do is start looking at what's right with people. And it may sound simple, but it wasn't what was in the field at that point. And from that thoughts, I started saying, well, how do you start finding out what's right with people? So just to give one example was when parents would come to see me about their child who was having problems, I'm almost embarrassed to tell you this. I could spend 2 hours with them. 99% was on their child's problems. If I would consult to schools about a particular child, we'd spend the whole hour on what's wrong with this child. When I was with my adult patients, they'd come in, sure, they're having problems, but I could spend the whole time on their problems. And one day, again, this stands out so clearly in my mind. I came home and it was that day was like every one of my patients was not doing very well. And I sat down to decompress and I said, it's like all of my patients are drowning in an ocean of self-perceived inadequacy. I don't know why that came to me. And then all of a sudden I said, well, if there are this ocean of inadequacy, there must be islands of competence. And at that point, I said, from now on, if I'm meeting with parents, after just 10, 15 minutes of hearing about their child's problems, I'm going to just politely interrupt and say, now that I've heard about some of the problems, can you please tell me what you see as your child's beauty, their strengths, their islands of competence? For some reason, that notion of islands of competence, which is another way of saying areas of strength, really caught on. I would say it to teachers who were working with kids. But then I started asking adults themselves, you're here because you have problems. But I would start saying things like, tell me one of the last times you were happy, really felt happy. What was the activity? In a relationship, tell me this. So wherever the answers went, I would really follow them. And this is what was so fascinating. I had no idea where it was going, but I was feeling depressed if I didn't ask these questions. So I started asking them. It was like whomever I was asking these questions about themselves or their children, I felt they became more talkative, if you will. I felt they were better problem solvers, more willing to look at things. Little did I know, 35 years later, I started reading this research, which had not taken place then, about the impact of creating positive emotions on problem solving and decision making, on interpersonal relationships. And I said, you know what I was probably doing back then, which certainly helped me, was I was creating positive emotions. And it was only rarely, I will tell you, once in a while, very seldom, I'm smiling now about it, a parent might say, Dr. Brooks, I didn't come here to talk about my child's strengths or beauty, as you call it. I came here to talk about his or her problems so you could basically fix it. And I was always very empathic because part of me felt like saying, well, that's why it's a problem here if we don't look at their strengths. But I would say, we're going to get to the problems. But the more children feel that we are not disappointed in them, the more they feel this unconditional love, that we view their strengths, not ignoring their problems, but we view their strengths, I think we could be of greater help to them. So that experience at McLean, I know it's somewhat long-winded here, really started to get me to think about, one, I had to think about my own emotions. Why am I getting so down after these interviews? Because all we talked about were down things. And then it led, this was an exciting part of my career. It was that point I said, how does a resilient child or adult see the world differently from one who is not? And this is what led to mindsets. What are their assumptions and expectations? And I've loved my career, but there's some parts of it, even you're really excited. So, I start looking at all the research I can. I think of the patients, I've had over the years, and you start articulating what I call then a resilient mindset. And I said, the more you could identify the components of a resilient mindset, the more you can try to nurture these in yourself, but they provide goalposts also for working with others. And I know you do a lot of work with executives. Same thing. How do you create an environment where everyone wants to be and everyone's productive? Well, I just went on and on. There were other things, but I captured the highlights of this. So,
Yeah, thank you. You did a beautiful job of sharing that because I think I certainly already got so many nuggets from your story and what you shared
thank you.
and the heart of it.
Mm,
And if I may kind of reflect back a couple of the nuggets that really stuck with me. One of them is that concept of the resilient mindset, which we'll
mm,
talk even more about in a moment, and what that means. And I think that another aspect of mindset, of course, is our mindset about other people. And
mm,
so when you had that, dark time, if you will, as a new, principal head of the school, and it occurred to you that, you didn't use the word belief. My interpretation was, our perception, our beliefs about these kiddos, whether it's the parents or yours, the staff's, and shifting from only seeing what is missing, the deficit, as you said, to what are those islands of competence and what makes these kids light up and what works, these, bringing up these positive emotions. I think that makes a big difference. The belief that we have in others, especially in younger people, as they navigate adversities in their life, not only if they've had traumas as younger ones, really throughout all of life. For example, my belief in my spouse and my children and everybody in my life, of course, my clients, I believe makes a big difference. And
mm,
then the second thing that really stuck out is again bringing up the positive emotions in people and how healing that can be, to shift that focus and to do it from a curious mindset, of just like, what has been a great day, what is working, when are your kids behaving well, and I think that mindset is so important, not only as parents or practitioners or teachers, staff at schools. I think it's also really important, of course, in leadership, because and actually one of the keynotes that I give is called leading with the heart in mind, and we
mm.
talk about
Love that.
compassion and how important it is to activate the heart and all that, because it really shifts our perception, and from that more objective lens, we're able to see things that I believe, blocked ourselves from seeing. We could not see in that moment. And those bring resources and learnings that can then help us to help ourselves and others even more. So
I
thank you
do.
for sharing.
Well, thank you for bringing up mindsets. Again, this is a little embarrassing, But if you had known me during what I call my burnout phase, if you had known me and said, "Bob, these kids are really getting to you," I'd say yes. And you had asked me to describe them, I probably would have said, "I think they're out to get me. I think every night they plot on the inpatient unit how to make my life miserable." Now, I probably wouldn't have put it quite that way, but you're so right. And the other thing you learn is you may think you're hiding your mindset, but you're not. Why I just thought of this morning, or yesterday, we were reading the Boston Globe, and there was an obituary on Robert Rosenthal, and I'll just tell you a little about him. He, in the 1950s or so, was really showed the power of mindset. He was the one. He was a faculty member at Harvard who went into a school. I think the school was out in California, but it didn't matter, and wanted to see what do expectations do in terms of, as teachers, how you relate to kids. So you may have heard some of the study without really knowing his name. So he went basically into a school and tested kids, and then sat down with teachers and said, each of you is very fortunate. Each of you has, he called them bloomers or something, boomers, or I forget. I call them budding superstars. And he said, you're very fortunate to have them in your class. I'll even tell you who they are. And then you could, yes, the school year ends. He then tests all the kids again. I hadn't realized it went up this much. Like IQ scores went up 20 points. I realized there's debate about what IQ is measuring anyway, but 20 points or so. They went up for the kids who the teachers had been told are these budding superstars, but not for the others. The interesting thing, that's why I loved your comment. The interesting thing was basically the teacher said, we didn't do anything. We treated all kids the same. But there had been observers in a class. So let's say a teacher calls on a budding superstar and the budding superstar says, I don't know. You know what the teacher's mindset is? Well, if my budding superstar doesn't know, maybe I have to go over it again. They call on a kid in the class who's not on the list of budding superstars. They say, I don't know an answer. They'll actually say things like, you have to pay closer attention. Or, we covered this yesterday. What reading this obituary, because he had been also one of my heroes, reading the obituary, he said that people sometimes are not even aware of it, but the recipient is certainly aware of it. And then he wrote this book called Pygmalion in the Classroom about that research. So when you just said it, those kids probably knew I had little faith in them. They probably knew I did not like them. And I didn't like them because I thought they were aggravating me. The real thing was, it was really me. My mindset was, you're really failing here.
Mm.
And, and that's why we had to change a great deal. And if an employer or a leader sees a staff member as lazy and not trying, they're going to treat them, we know, they're going to treat them as very differently if they say, this person is really struggling right now with this project. Let me see how I can help. So mindsets really impact on our behavior, but then our behavior, it's a cycle. Our behavior impacts on our mindset. So it's constantly going. And if the mindset always is negative, it's just going to become very negative. If someone could short circuit that mindset and ask, can you please tell me your strengths now? By the way, I didn't know any of this. These are thoughts that emerged after I did it. Then it could be just, for me, you short circuit it, you give people time to really think about the mindset and how what they're saying or doing is impacting on others.
Yeah,
So thank you for bringing up and emphasizing the whole issue of mindsets.
well, I thank you for bringing that up, and also, Dr. Rosenthal, because I honor what he's done in his research, and it is so, so, so important for us to realize it really is a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes.
And it's not to say that we're at fault if the people in our life are struggling. There is an opportunity to be curious and say, what do I believe about
Yes.
my employee, my child, my spouse, my friend, whomever? And to notice if there is any resistance there, if there are any expectations that are lower, let's say doubt, right, about somebody's ability to become a master at something or to even learn something and excel. then we're going to be limiting them through
Hmm.
our projection. And we know that to be true, not only, of course, in our again, it's unconscious. It's not necessarily that we're out to hurt somebody
Right.
or to limit their growth. Of course, it's unconscious. And so it could be in our body language, or facial expressions, anything like that, or tone of voice, of course, the words that we share and the things that we do. I believe it's also energetic because if we're radiating these kind of lower vibration emotions around people, we have research that their nervous system picks up on it.
Yes.
And that travels, to their head brain and maybe they begin to doubt themselves or to question their own capabilities. And that's very unfortunate when our intent as teachers, as parents, as leaders is to uplift and not, limit or shrink somebody's potential.
Well, what you just said, why I felt so burned out in that position in McLean at first is here I studied to be a, clinical psychologist. I wanted to help people. And there were two factors. One is I felt they were getting worse, as I mentioned, they were getting more angry. But the other thing is that feeling of hopelessness or helplessness. I didn't know what to do. So if if at least you have a sense of what to do, you're not going to feel quite as depressed. But I'd say, what do I do? Everything I knew to do, these kids are sabotaging. See, I always blame them. It was very easy to blame them. It was amazing how many resistant people I saw in the first few years of my career and I kid about that, but I often, if they're not responding, I'm trying to be helpful, they're resistant. But that's a whole other talk. What
A
is
natural
really,
response.
yeah, I thought it, but then these doubts they start seeping in, and what is your staff doing? What are you doing? And so it really takes a toll on you because you're just feeling I don't know what to do. I went into this field to help people, and then of course it's easy to blame the kids, as I said, but they're not letting me help them, rather than asking what can I do differently so they may be more responsive to me helping them? It sounds so simple now, doesn't it? Not at the time, though.
And again, thank you for your vulnerability in sharing this, especially, coming from somebody that had that background. And it just gives us permission to feel those feelings too, because, it's very natural during that time when, we perceive, right, that things are not working the way that we want, we're not seeing the results yet about anything in our life. And it's very common to blame others and blame ourselves, right?
Mhm.
Some of us have more inclination to go to the other and some more, to blame ourselves. The point of it here is the sense of agency and control, and it's like that sense of helplessness and hopelessness that you shared, that I think is the toughest. And I'm curious about the research around that sense of agency. I know we see that in the change management work that I
Mhm.
do when leaders and employees feel that they have some sense of ownership around a change. I'm curious how you see that in your research on resilience.
Sure, it's critical. I think, especially, well, even before I was going to say, especially since COVID, I use the term personal control, which some people say sounds very much like the Serenity Prayer. And a lot of my work is based on DC and Ryan's model of motivation and resilience. They're two psychologists, and it's called self-determination theory, even though they bring in other aspects to that theory, such as you're going to be more motivated if you have a sense of purpose. And what I found is, one, looking at myself when I was feeling really down, I felt I had no sense of agency, no direction. And what you brought up, I'm going to just underscore, because in a lot of the patients I was seeing, whether children or adults, within a session or two, that would come up. One boy in the first session to me had learning problems and he was struggling in school. And he said to me, why did God choose me to be the one with ADHD? Now, if you think about that, his mindset is it was chosen by God. And I'm not going to change at all. A woman came in to see me. The work had to do a lot with her daughter also. She's a single mother, a 5-year-old daughter. And the mother grew up in an abusive home and swore, she said, I would never hit my own child. But she started spanking her child, only 5 years old, on a regular basis. And when she called me, she said, I am desperate. And I bring this up because I meet her, lovely person, really feeling desperate. She said the only thing my daughter listens to is if I basically spank her, and that doesn't last very long. And she didn't know what to do. Her relation with the daughter was going really downhill. But when I asked her, because again, into mindsets, how she understood her daughter's behavior, this was one of the most incredible sessions. You know, there are some you say, I am really glad I'm in this field, or some workshops we give. She said, Dr. Brooks, you're going to think I'm crazy when I tell you why I think my daughter acts the way she does. And, I kidded. I said, you're in a psychologist's office. I've heard a lot. She said, not this. It was literally her almost 10 minutes. And finally, she told me, and it just underscores the point you made. She said, I know it sounds crazy, but I think my daughter has, quotes, a personal vendetta against me. Now, I grew up in the streets of Brooklyn. I know what personal vendettas are. But then, I'll just tell you a little about this because I learned so much from this woman. Uh, I, I said to her, well, now I understand if someone feels someone has a personal vendetta against them, they're not going to be very empathic and, they're going to be very angry. And this is something also I learned because I often will use that example and then say to the audience, I just did a workshop I gave on Friday. If you were me, after this excruciating 10 minutes, what would you say, to this woman? And I say there are a lot of things to say, but think of the pain, think how she thinks I'm going to think of her. And so what I said to her, and again, there are different ways, I said, I know it took a lot of courage on your part to tell me that. And her whole body, we're talking about, just seemed to relax. And then I've learned something else. I hope we're not too off with this, what I'm bringing up now. It's really about communicating. I learned that, people are doing the best they can. We have to start with that assumption. This mother was doing the best she could with very little support. And I always said one has to be very careful in no way criticizing the way they have coped. So I said to this mother, if we think our kid has a personal vendetta against us, we are probably going to strike out at them. But I said, can I give you another way of looking at your daughter and another way of responding? And what I shared with her was that everything she told me, her daughter was born with what, the researchers called a more difficult temperament. And I said some kids are born with more difficult temperaments. I even wrote several articles on my website. I tell people you could go to, the research. And then I'll end with this because even telling it, it's very emotional. She said to me, she started to cry again. And I'm condensing like a full session or two into, and I said, well, what are the tears about? And she said, I just realized something, Bob. I've been punishing a suffering child. And those words were so powerful. And I said, yeah, but at the time you didn't know what to do differently. And then, she had a great smile. So I said, but now we're going to look at different ways of handling this. And she said, I won't hit her again. And I said, that's good. It may be a lot of effort. She said, why would you hit a suffering child? And at that moment, I said, my God, I work with a lot of people who respond to suffering children by being more punitive because their mindset is this kid is out to get me or whatever. So your comment about mindsets just triggered so much that, how do we change the mindsets? How do we change it where people don't want to change it, even though it's not been helpful? How are you able to say to someone that this is one way of looking at things? Can I share with you another? And that I've also been writing a great deal about preparing people to hear a message that they may not want to hear. And that's even in workshops I give. Some of the ideas I have, I know some people in the audience are not going to necessarily agree with them. So I'll always say, I have this thought, I just want to bring it up, but if you disagree with me, please let me know.
Mm.
That short circuits a quick negative feeling like this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. So the comment to mindset really just resonated with me and brought up images of certain people I've seen in therapy and certain people I've supervised as well. who could feel very vulnerable.
Well, I think it was a very precious story to share with us. And I say that because I think there are people listening who have probably felt
Mhm.
that way, whether it was, somebody in their life that's, kind of out to get them, or even if it's not as extreme as that, that's somebody who is not listening to them or doesn't care
Mhm.
about them
Mhm.
or doesn't appreciate them and all that they're doing. And right. So there's different versions of that. And to first of all, uh, accept ourselves just as you accepted her and how she was feeling in the sense of, I honor the courage that it took to express that. Um, and and even for ourselves to say, well, really just to pause and label how we feel and say, I accept that this is how I feel, right? That this is my perception of the situation. And it requires a lot of grace to do that, to accept these, thoughts that many of us are shamed to have. And when we judge others for that, then we're kind of shaming them all over again, right? So we want to have a lot of grace with
Great
ourselves and
point.
others. And once we meet them where they're at, just as you said, you honor her state and where she is and what she's done, and the fact that she's been doing her best, as all of our listeners are always doing the very best that they can with the resources they have and the state that they're in that moment, and then to invite another perspective. And that's what you did. And so I invite, our listeners to do the same, is to first have some self-compassion for the way that they've been with the people in their lives. If they're not super proud of moments, and we've all had them, my goodness, right? I have 3 daughters. I've had many of those that I look back and I meant, oh my gosh,
Oh,
if
my
I
son's
only
already going to
knew.
go call daddy dear, so I can relate to that.
We're human, right? That's the thing that brings
Right.
us all together, right? We're all humans, and we make mistakes, and in the moment they're the best that we could do. So
Mhm.
it's like, okay, now that we know better, what can we do about that moving forward? How can we first, take care of ourselves, and then of course take care of others? Because if I'm in a depleted mindset, I'm more likely to see, or excuse me, in a depleted state, meaning I'm tired, I'm anxious, I'm stressed out, whatever that might be, I'm overwhelmed. I'm less likely to see the good in other people, in my kids, employees, and others. I'm less likely to to see the truth, which is that more than likely these people are not out to get me. They are
Right.
suffering in their own way, right?
Mm.
And it's just being expressed in a way like that. So thank you for that story.
Well, I want to add one more point, something else you said. Boy, you trigger a lot. Trigger maybe, I don't know. That one of the things I started to do, and lately well, I shouldn't say just lately, for a number of years, I've been writing about the power of one moment, one instance, and how it could impact on your life. And I started asking both children and adults I saw in therapy what they remembered about especially if they've been in therapy at least 6, 7 months, what they remembered about the first session or two, because I've even written about that first session already. We're communicating messages to them about how we can be of help. And I wanted to bring this up because it's interesting at certain points in your life, someone could come into your life and say, do something that has such, I'll say, such an impact. This mother, when I also ended up seeing her daughter for several sessions, but mainly worked with a mother. This mother, I said, so what did you remember? And it was interesting. She especially remembered the comment. She said, I was feeling so scared and vulnerable when you said it was very courageous of me to do this. At that point, and it's just one comment that I say to people, it could be sometimes just one comment that makes the world of difference. And she said, at that point, I knew I was going to be safe in your office. Well, as a therapist, you want people to feel that, or at a place of work, you want people to feel that. So that's what I started saying to, when I was supervising and doing therapy seminars. Think about the following. I talk a lot about empathy, and I would say, write down all the words you hope your client will use to describe you, or with parents, your child will use to describe you. It could be any relationship your employees would use to describe you. And then I'll always say, and this a lot of training I do, what are two or three things you intentionally do so they're likely to describe you in the way you hope they would describe you? And I say, look, everyone's going to see us differently. It's not like they're all going to have one template of us, but it gets us to think about, you know, the whole issue of empathy. How do we want this person to describe us? And what do we intentionally say and do? And I think I say to people, I'd like to, it'd be very natural, but some things we have to do very intentionally in that regard. So, with this woman, it was very intentional. And for her, it's almost like this few words about courage just got, implanted in her mind. And that's every session she came in, she basically was going to see you that way, that it's safe here. So something you said that also got that going.
Oh, I have goosebumps when you share that, literally. And it just touched my heart because, I think in that moment, it was such an authentic, real, compassionate moment where you were being with her. You were not judging her, probably like she's been judged or judged herself for many years. And it's like probably one of the, I'm hallucinating here that it was one of the few times in her life, or at least as she recalled, that someone gave her that gift of just genuine presence and compassion and a respect for her doing her best. And oftentimes we are so focused on what we're not doing right, doing enough of. We have so much evidence in our world, right? Facebook and otherwise, of these perfect leaders, these perfect parents, or these perfect kids, and all this stuff. And it's like we judge ourselves, what am I doing wrong or not enough of too much of, So I think that you gave her a precious gift. And I think what's important to realize here is that two things. Number one, we can give that gift to others to truly see those islands of competence in others, or help them to see that for themselves. Yeah. And also to give that to ourselves, right? We can look in
Mhm.
the mirror and train ourselves to say, I'm a good person. I'm doing the best that I can. I am worthy. I'm worthy of love. I am, right. I'm a good parent, or I'm doing my best to be a good parent, or I'm becoming, a good leader, whatever that might be. Because I think that for us to hear that again and again and again, it does shift some of those mindsets, and over time we begin to really receive them and to believe them.
Yes.
Um, yeah.
Just put everything so eloquently. And I love the word gift. In one sense, it is a gift, just as she gave me a gift also, because and even the daughter was, well, sweet with me, but her daughter was one of these temperamentally difficult kids. But you know, when you learn so much from the people you're working with, and it could be as a supervisor, it could be as a therapist, there are gifts all around. You know, if you look at the research on resilience, and Emmy Werner, who was a Holocaust survivor, did a longitudinal study, and Julia Siegel, who's one of my heroes, psychologist, when they interviewed these adults, a question I raised years before, and who really faced great adversity, and said, "We could have never predicted you would be as hopeful and as optimistic as you are. What do you think was the basic thing?" In almost every study, if not every study, the first answer was always there was at least one person along the way who believed in them and stood by them. Hopefully, there were many. And Siegel was the one who, in a very brief 3-page article that I quote in all of my articles, uh, he said, if you look at research, he called them, children of misfortune, kids who face great adversity around the world. The one finding is that they all, and the ones who really are doing very well as adults, is that they had the presence of what he called a charismatic adult in their life, which sometimes I almost wish he hadn't used the word charismatic. People have different feelings, but I love his definition. An adult from whom a child or adolescent gathers strength. And then, and I say to people, I remember getting questions at first when I would bring this up. Do we as adults need such people in our lives? And yes, unless we've decided to be a hermit off by ourselves somewhere. And that's when I really more and more realize that, of course, resilience is rooted in the relationships we have with others, the positive relationships. And again, I became more interested. We should never underestimate even a brief interaction with someone. Like when you give a workshop, I'm sure that there are people in the audience who will remember certain things you said, probably all that you said, but certain things that they will take away because whatever it is, it resonated with them at that particular point, and they're going to then use it with others. And that's why more and more, whether it's in therapy or giving a workshop, I would ask myself, how do you want the audience to see you? How do you create positive emotions right at the beginning so that they're going to be much more open to hearing you? And one issue is really the vulnerability. I always start my talks with parents by telling some stories about my sons that I did not handle very well. And people will say, if you hadn't told that story, I'd think there's this Harvard professor who, on and on. So it was really very exciting for me. As a lot of things I maybe did a little more intuitively years ago, and then more research comes out and more brain research that you start saying, oh, that's why that may have worked at that time, like islands of competence, and people are all of a sudden talking with you more.
Well, I would love if you're willing to maybe share one, if you're willing to share one of those stories. I would love to hear that of you as a parent and maybe what you learned from the experience, because I imagine that those of us listening can benefit from your
Okay.
experience.
Okay. Well, the first one that always comes to mind, my oldest son, Rich, who's a lovely adult and doing very well today, he did no work in school, no homework in the eighth, ninth, 10th, and 11th grades. And he thought homework was optional. I did not, nor did his teachers. And I'm just going to go into a little detail about the power of empathy, or in another way, I learned it's very easy to be empathic towards those people, including our children, who do exactly what we want and agree with us. So anyway, what happened was here I am, an expert on motivation. I've written a lot about motivation. I'm lecturing all over the country on how to motivate students. All his teachers had taken my workshop on how to motivate students. And I say this, I think I may be the only parent who ever received a warning slip where I was quoted on the warning slip. This lovely teacher said, I think this is part of the adolescent rebellion you told us about. And I remember saying, the heck with the adolescent rebellion, he's going to do his work. And now I'll get into what I learned, but what a failure. Here I am working at a psychiatric hospital in McLean, and I am Dr. Empathy. I always would say to the staff, you know, put yourself in the shoes of the person you're seeing in therapy, on and on. The moment I came home, the very first question I asked Rich, for 4 straight years, except for summer breaks, people say, you asked him this question for 4 years? Yes. The question was, Rich, did you do your homework yet? That was my opening question. Why would you ask such a question? Right away, you knew it was going to be a lot of tension. And part of it was, we talked about mindsets. My mindset was he could do it if he wanted to, which he probably could, but other things, obviously, he has other interests, and homework is not one of them. And remember, the question is, how would your son or daughter describe you? How would you hope they describe you? Questions like that. One day I came home, it was the fourth year, and I said, don't ask Rich about his homework. But that's why I talk a lot about negative scripts in my books. I came in, and all of a sudden, what am I asking him about homework? And this was one of when at the very beginning of our interview, I talked about how uh, that we should really think about, even throughout the interview, about what we say and what we do and how we come across. And I also said, if I asked parents, what are two or three of the best days you've ever had, two or three of the most difficult, this was probably one of the most difficult days I ever had. Uh, as I started to talk to him, he just walked away, sort of moved his hand as if to say, I'm out of here. And I'm thinking, oh, you're a so-called expert on family relationships and parenting, and in your own home, your son doesn't want to be with you. It was my issue, not his. See, how could Robert Brooks's son, the person who has written about motivation, how come he's not doing his own work? And so it was really my issue. And you see, and then I'll tell you how the story ends. Motivation, one of the things we have to realize, we say kids are not motivated when we're really saying that they're not motivated to do what we want them to do. Rich wasn't doing his homework, but he was actually president of the youth group at our temple. He could get up and speak to 200 people with ease. He volunteered and read reading at a homeless shelter. But see, he didn't get a grade for that. And so what happened was this particular day, as he's walking away from me, I'm saying, if he described me right now, he'd say, my father only cares about my grades and nothing else. And at that point, I really started to change because I said, what I've been doing certainly has not gotten him to do homework. And although it took him still another 6 months, he then started to turn things around. But I didn't want a son who says he only cares about my grades. And my wife always says, if you use the story of Rich, tell them that you and Rich are very close today. So I'll mention it. We're very close today. How we got close was her idea because she actually read one of my books about parent-child relationships on that. What was the other thing, which I always say to parents, is find those special moments with your kids. So it was easier with two. Every Wednesday, I would rush home from the hospital, take Doug out one Wednesday, our younger son, and Rich out the next Wednesday, just a hamburg place. And Rich had a rule, you can't discuss school. And I said, I'm happy with that rule. I'll get indigestion. But remember before I talked about those moments we had? When Rich went to college, he did a best to go. When he went to college, when he came home for the first holiday or whatever it is, one of the first things he said, are we still going to do Wednesday night dinner? It became such a tradition for him. And I bring that up with parents. Each kid has their own path to take in life. And no child was put on this earth to make us feel like good parents necessarily. It's very challenging. I don't care what kind of an expert you are. I had to come, just like with the kids at the hospital years before, I had to look at what I had to change. I had a wonderful son, very warm and affectionate. Okay, he didn't want to do his homework. I didn't want to tell him about some of the research, which really wonders about the benefits of homework anyway, because he would have used that. Uh, that was probably one of the biggest struggles. I'm glad it happened though, because else I would have thought like Douglas would do his homework, just do his homework. I thought that's what people do when they grow up in a supportive home. But everyone has their own path in life. And Rich ended up starting his own company and is doing very well. And when he had kids of his own, I loved to watch how he related to them. Uh, so you learn, and it's not necessarily always going to turn out as well, but you really, as a parent, have to start thinking about your own expectations for your kids. What is important? And really, I started to say to parents, especially when I talked about uh, every child has different temperament. We as parents have to learn to accommodate much more to their interests and temperament than expecting them to accommodate to ours. And I say this does mean if your kid is acting very poorly or acting out, you don't set limits. You certainly do, but not every kid's going to be a super athlete. Not every kid is going to be a student, and I could go on and on. And if children grow up in a home where they feel they're constantly disappointing the parent, they're going to get angry. They're going to be upset because it's really conditional love. My parent will only love me if I get good grades. And I felt I was falling into that trap with Rich. So it was very important that it happened, even though it wasn't my proudest moment. But it gives good material when I talk to parents.
And again, it reminds us that we're all human and that we do the best and that we learn from experiences. So, what tips can you give to parents and by extension to leaders from this experience with Rich around how to do that, how to adapt to the way that somebody is and to again, strengthen more of those islands of competence in the relationship?
Yeah, it's a very important question. With a leader, whomever, one has to look at, first of all, there might be an employee or someone you're supervising who really wouldn't need a great deal of, and it's a good, not a good fit, if you will, with that and them. And it's sometimes, not that I had to do it often, sometimes I had to let certain staff go after much work. But now the real positive, I also found there were some staff when I was a leader of a unit and then when I left McLean, I was head of both child and adult psychology. Some staff and some trainees, it was just lovely that when your expectation was that we hadn't given them a clear role or their job requirements were not very clear, that they could really rise to the occasion. But I also felt we had to do it in a way where they felt that we were accepting them, that we really were there to help, and we didn't say things like just try harder or you could do it if you wanted to do it. So one of the things is I found as a leader and as a father and as a therapist that I start with the assumption that people can grow. I also start with the assumption that for some people they can grow, and as they're growing in therapy, it may be that what in their real life, whatever job they're in, may not be the right job. Or I worked with one man once who some people might have, well, I would have considered a treatment failure probably years ago, when the best thing he could do, he's a 40-year-old man, his father was a very abusive 70-year-old, when this man could finally say to himself, my father will never accept me. And he cut off, discussions with his father. This man was alcoholic. He really got sober, and he said, I can focus now on my wife and kids. So I think with leaders, we have to start with the assumption that we're going to help these people grow. And in order to help them grow, you have to have a very safe environment in that regard. But growth can lead us into different directions. And that's what I also will say. And growth for me with Rich was very important because I said, he really wasn't put on this earth to make me feel happy. And once I could really accept that message, and okay, I have a son who doesn't do his homework, but my God, he's doing so many other things, it's helpful. Where it becomes very problematic and very challenging is, some of the kids who are having so many difficulties and you don't even know where to start. We know report after report since COVID, it was even before the anxiety in kids, depression and mental health issues, and parents feeling it as well. And, I'm not necessarily saying everyone should be in a counseling relation, but sometimes it could get so heavy. It could be very helpful to speak with someone who at least re offer realistic optimism, as I always say, not this any kind of phony optimism, but that there are strategies we can use to help kids. Like one example, one of the foundations for me of resilience, besides having this charismatic adult, is more and more research started coming out that when people are helping other people, whatever it is, a 4-year-old helping others. And in one of my books, I say, I think there's an inborn need to children for children want to help if you see how much they do want to help. But the research came out showing that when we give kids opportunity to help, it actually lessens stress. During COVID, there were schools I consulted with, all virtual, that when they had kids raising money for first responders or food banks, it lessened their stress. And the same with adults. They had research to show elderly people, and this was even before COVID, if they felt they were helping even an hour a week someone, it lessened their stress and their stress response, even if they were in stressful situations. So, we look at the strengths and we look at how we feel. Can we make a difference? And, I always say also, how do we handle our own mistakes and our kids? And you've put it very nicely. Mistakes, as much as possible, we have to see as opportunities for learning. It's very easy to say, but it's not necessarily easy to live by. And even as parents, like myself, you can get into, if you don't do your, oh, I'm so embarrassed, if you don't do your homework, what are you going to do in life? All of this kind of thing. But we really, as anyone in a leadership position or any parent or therapist, those mistakes serve as wonderful opportunities to say, okay, this didn't work. Let's think about what may work next time. I always say resilient people see problems as things to be solved rather than overwhelmed by. It's a whole mindset. I can solve this. I may have to, call on other people, but I can really solve this. People get most anxious and depressed if they feel they have no control, they don't know what to do. And that's how I felt when I was principal of the school and psychiatric hospital. I didn't know what to do at all. And fortunately, as I said, I had a very good staff, and together we could start saying what we have to do differently.
And if I may ask one more follow-up question on this through the
Sure.
lens of parenting.
Your questions have really triggered a lot, as you could see.
Oh, thank you. I'm just very grateful for all of your stories and of course the incredible insights and guidance that you're giving
Thank
us
you.
here today. What about if there's let's say a parent who is listening or watching us today and is saying, all right, like I have said to my child that I believe in them. And I have offered opportunities to help, let's say,
Mhm.
to help others. And I have done everything that I could. I have given them everything that I have. And my child, with everything that's going on in school, social media, just the world as it is anxious and they're overwhelmed. Maybe they're depressed. Maybe they even have suicidal ideation.
Mhm.
What can I do as a parent, in addition to what you've already helped today,
Mhm.
to help my child, be more resilient through these adversities that he or she is facing? What can I do to help my child?
Yeah, I love your questions once more. First of all, I always tell people, because a couple times I got in questions, Bob, it's almost worded this way. Can you guarantee if we do everything you say, that'll work? And I said, excuse me, if we could guarantee anything like that, we'd all be billionaires or something. We'd have this formula. So one thing is, we know every kid, even from birth, has different temperaments. Some kids will have an easier time becoming resilient than other kids, just given their inborn temperament, their learning style. So I certainly want people to know what may work for one child may not work for another. The issue of having tried everything, or so it feels, is a very powerful one. And when parents would call me or at my workshops, I would say, if you're sitting with those feelings too long and really upset, and again, it's as I said before, I don't recommend counseling necessarily for everyone, but I think any parent who is really overwhelmed with the feelings and they're feeling what their kid is feeling, sometimes professional help is needed. Sometimes, and this is where I always have to know more information. Sometimes a parent will say, I think a lot of it, is going on in the school. That's when I'll also involve the school. There may be some kid programs in the school, like, you know, there was one boy in the school. He was a rather depressed, anxious 13-year-old. And his parents, I always say we must honor our children's islands of competence. He had a sister who was super A students, social butterfly. You get the picture. This kid's born, he has, excuse me, developmental lags and whatever. And when I asked the parents about his islands of competence, and you'll see why I'm bringing this up, sometimes we have to think in a different way. They said they were disappointed in him. They told me, and his island of competence was, taking care of plants and things like that, horticulture. And for them, and he knew it. They could not accept him. They would say to me, "I wish he could be like his sister," and I would say, "But he's not like your sister." Anyway, they thought they had tried everything. I don't even know what they were trying. Some because the main thing was acceptance. What was really nice, a number of the issues were social skills in school. He actually, with great people at school working, they started a horticulture club. He then now had a few friends who he had not had before. His plants were in the lobby the moment he walked into school each morning. What did he see? It still took the parents time to accept, but when there was some kind of like horticulture show or something, and he was part of it, and that was one of the first times, and this is after a year of therapy, that they could get rid of we're disappointed in our son and say, what we really have to look at is, what he is doing now. The reason I bring that example up is really to emphasize, if you have worries about your child, please speak to someone. If you've tried different things, there may be other things that could be attempted. We learn from these different kinds of things. The parents of this horticulture kid, they thought it was just by demanding more and more of him. But both his learning style and psychologically, he couldn't give it, and he was getting more and more angry and depressed. But once he found, and I always say, identify, reinforce, and if possible, display, which we did with him, his island of competence, he could do it. So anyone who's listening and says, I'm really not sure where to turn, maybe speak to a pediatrician, get a referral. Sometimes school counselors, when I say sometimes, some are so overbooked, but even speaking to the school counselor, there, but find that someone that you can discuss with, who's that going to be that charismatic adult for you for a little while. And not that it helps, but certainly we know this is a very challenging time for a number of kids uh, based on COVID. It's not just COVID, the political divisiveness in our country, the anger in our country, and not just country, the world. I know one of the ways I cope is I don't watch as much TV. I will read the New York Times or Boston Globe online because I could actually then moderate what I'm reading and what I'm not reading. Uh, Instead, I mainly stick with sports. TV. I mean, it might sound funny, but we learn different ways. And I know you're really accept this. The other thing for ourselves, there's so many self help. I mean, everything, diet and exercise, meditation, that I certainly have found very helpful. But I think most people will, and it doesn't mean you're training for a decathlon, just 20 minutes, a half hour. I'll use the treadmill at least a half hour every morning and just meditate. I meditate probably like a 5-year-old would just with my breath, but it's very helpful and it doesn't have to take a lot of time. So we also have to, in the situations you mentioned, we also have to look, how can we take care of ourselves so we're better equipped to deal with our kids' distress?
Thank you. And it brings us back to this idea of the self-determination theory, as you called it, agency, that sense of control,
Mhm.
because even though we may feel helpless and hopeless in moments of our life, or maybe even extended periods of time in our life, the truth is that we are never truly hopeless or helpless, because we can change our response to things.
Yes.
Oftentimes, as you said, it starts with us. Uh,
Mhm.
and what we can do to manage our own state, to build our own resilience, release stress, whatever that might be. And that also shifts our perceptions of the people and things in our world.
Exactly.
And of course, we can look at opportunities, ask for help for our children, our employees, and ourselves when we're at a place that we just don't know what else to do, where that too is a choice and the resources are out there. And so I thank you for reminding us of
I'm
that.
going to underline that and say what I learned, especially with a book like Man's Search for Meaning, and Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor. He talks about that what we have more control over than we realize is our attitude and response to things. And he gives some very poignant examples in the concentration camps. It was pure hell there, but he talks about the goodness of some people there and what they did. So I always say to people, I know it could seem very dark, but we may have more control over our attitude and our response to things than we realize.
That's right.
Often, and it helps to have that charismatic adult or a few of them in your life to go along with the trip with you.
Yeah. And I thank you for that. And I always say, when we play, right, what I call the mindset game, which is the name of this show,
Mm.
by managing our state, accepting how we feel, how we think, and then activating our heart with compassion for ourselves or others, to shift the meaning that we give to things, our perceptions of things, and then everything changes when we do that, because it all comes down to the stories that we tell ourselves about the people and things around us, and we do have, I believe, agency to support others, and to change that reality. So thank you, Dr. Brooks, for this just such a beautiful conversation. It was like delicious, and I loved every
The
moment of
feeling,
it.
feeling is mutual.
And how can people learn more about these incredible trainings that you do, your amazing books, all the articles on your website?
Yeah, I think the easiest is just to go to my website. I have now like 250 briefer articles because I write one a month, except for the summer months, and it's just drdrobertbrooks.com. Kept it simple, and there's just different material, and there's also speaking engagements and topics I do. So I think that, excuse me, that would be the easiest, I would say.
Well, I invite our listeners to go check that out. And again, thank you from my heart for all that you do for our world, for our kids, and for ourselves, for everyone who's listening to today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.